ruling cited. Rav Ulla said in the name of Rav Elazar, when brothers divide an estate, okay, we on 11b2. They come to calculate what is already received. We evaluate what is upon them, the clothes that they are wearing, but we do not evaluate what is upon their sons and daughters. Rav Papa said, qualifying the above ruling, there are times when we do not evaluate what is upon them either. And we find this law in the case of an elder's brother who clothes himself using funds from the undivided estate because it is agreeable for the brothers that he dress well, that his words be heard. Now, do you guys know what this means, or can I explain it to you?
I think I understand it.
Okay, anybody want to take a stab at it?
It's all about when considering the value of an estate and whether the clothes that a person's wearing, a child's wearing, are considered part of the estate or not. And depending on when it's bought and depending on, as I understand it, when a person dies and the reason was given to the birth child, etc., etc. Is it so that all the clothes taken into account, and it would be a waste of time to go to the best in, etc., to embarrass the person and so forth. I mean, that's sort of the general idea. That's where we.
Okay,
right.
So it's in terms of the general idea, it's pretty good. So let's just clarify very, very quickly what it's saying. Okay, firstly, that clothing are assets and they are included. Well, how do we know they're included? In terms of calculating the estate value, is that generally, if you owe money to a creditor, the debtor has to even give him his cloak. As safekeeping, and if he doesn't pay the debt, the debtor can take it. Because clothes today are inexpensive. They're mass-produced. You get at Mr. Price a cheap T-shirt, even a shirt today, if you're not paying in the South African rand, otherwise anything's expensive imported. But generally, clothes are mass-produced and inexpensive. In those days, most people received hand-me-down clothes. Does that make sense? And they were handmade and expensive. So it was calculated in front of the estate. What we're doing is we're saying a couple of things. Number one, that the brothers all share their late parents' estate. And although we evaluate the clothes of the brothers, we don't evaluate the clothes of their sons and daughters. Why? Because anybody, just say they lose their parents and their parents are in their 70s and the children are already in their 50s or late 40s or whatever the case may be, their children are much younger. So it's embarrassing for their sons and daughters to be evaluated while they're wearing those particular clothes. So what happens is that the sons and daughters are not evaluated while they're wearing weekday clothes, because weekday clothes were also inexpensive. So we don't make the sons and daughters of the brothers that have inherited measure their clothes while it's upon them. In other words, they're entitled to wear one set of clothing on them, and then the rest of their clothing is evaluated because it doesn't embarrass them. Why not? Because it's often the case that sons and daughters came with their respective parents to hear how the will was read out. Why? Because it was a legal case. So the court would say, right, the late parent has left the children the following. They've left the grandchildren the following. So it was a day outing for everybody. They went to the court. They heard who was left what. And the children would also go there. So we didn't want to embarrass the grandchildren by having them measured and checked, etc. So if they're wearing one set of clothes, the rest of their clothes are assessed. Does that make sense? That's number one, because they can only wear one set of clothing, and clothing that they have. We're not saying clothing that, for example, they're naturally wearing themselves. We're talking about clothing they inherited, because often money was very tight. If it's clothing that they had not from the estate, for sure they don't have to assess it. We're talking about clothing they inherited, because often what would happen is that they would inherit clothing because it's not that expensive, and then the complicated issues of the estate would be rolled out, like the properties, etc. So, they'd go through their father's belongings and then take a couple of items, but the complicated stuff would be read out in a will and testimony in court. Now, the children, by the way, the sons and daughters, are not allowed to wear their Shabbos clothes to the court. Why? Because those Shabbos clothes or Yom Tov clothes are very expensive. And therefore, that's assessed, even if the children are wearing them in court. So in order that their parents don't humiliate them, they have to wear during the week clothing. Does that make sense, guys? Okay, fine.
Yeah.
So also there's no court on Shabbos. So they don't have to wear smart clothes to go to the court, the grandchildren. So whatever they inherited has to just be assessed. Now what we're saying is because clothing has to be assessed, the brothers, there's money in the estate where the oldest brothers bought himself a fancy schmancy suit. Now the brothers can't complain after the fact. What are we saying? Is that if the sons that inherited are relatively young and they've got very young children, the other brother must, as Rabbi Cohen says, must look spitz, which is, I guess, a Yiddish word for looking smart and professional, like a business person, because the words that he says are going to carry more weight. So what does it mean? It means when the oldest brother tends to the affairs of the state, it's in the brother's interest that he dress well, so that he will command attention and respect in engaging in business on the family's behalf. So this is in Bava Basra 139a. Okay? And since the brothers benefited from the dignified clothing of the eldest brother, because he represented all the brothers in the past, because all the legal issues are discussed in court, not just inheritance. If the father had debtors that he owed money to, these business issues would be played out. So now the older brothers can't say, now that they've benefited by his dignified clothing, because he represents the whole family, that he must take off the cost of the clothing of his particular share of the estate. But they can protest initially. So in other words, they can say to him before they've derived the benefit, they can say, listen, you can look spitz, but you don't look like, you can have a nice car, like what we'd say today, is you don't have to drive your beaten up VW that's 30 years old. You can get yourself, rent yourself a nice car for the day, rent yourself a Merc or whatever, but you don't have to rent yourself a Porsche or a limo. It's a bit over the top. Or you can buy a nice suit, because today we judge on cars. Unfortunately, if you rock up to a meeting and you're in a fantastic suit and a good car and you've got a presence of success, people want to deal with you. In those days, it was no difference. If somebody rocked up and they barely had gas money and the car paint was coming off, nobody would have confidence putting their money in a person that couldn't self-manage their own finances. And it was the same then. Perception counts. So if all the brothers are benefiting from the perception of the one oldest brother looking spitz and representing the family well, they're all benefiting. So they can't say afterwards that he has to pay it from his share of the inheritance. They've either got to decide before that the older brother should look good, should look dignified, and by how much they have a budgetary allowing so that he can conduct his business meetings on behalf of the family, or they have the right to protest initially, but they can't protest after they've all benefited. Am I making sense, guys?
I've got to go. Sorry, James. Cheers,
No
guys. Have a good Shabbos.
Okay. Cheers, Michael.
All right. The rest of you guys, am I making sense?
Yeah, absolutely clear.
Pretty easy, simple.
Fine. Michael, you've got to go. I completely understand. You'll listen to the rest of the audio. There's no problem at all. Thank you so much for your time, Michael. Okay.
Cheers.
Shabbat shalom, Michael. Okay. So, guys, I'm just going to go on to the next thing quickly. So, what we're dealing with here is the next case. Okay. I hope I've explained it well. I'm using my own language and.
No, you've done it well, Damon.
Yeah, very, very clear, Damon. Very clear.
Right. So there's a sixth ruling by Rav Ulla in the name of Rav Elazar. And Ulla said in the name of Rav Elazar, if a custodian transferred a deposit to another custodian, without obtaining permission from the owner, the first custodian is exempt from liability for any loss for which he would have been exempt had he guarded the object himself. Okay. Before I go on, does everybody understand that statement?
Can you just repeat that statement? Sorry, I just heard.
No problem.
Just repeat it one more time.
And Ulla said in the name of Rav Elazar, if a custodian transferred a deposit to another custodian without obtaining permission from the owner, the first custodian is exempt from liability for any loss which he would have been exempt with had he guarded the object himself. So let me explain to you what we're saying here. Very, very simple.
Yeah, please, yeah.
No problem. So you're not allowed to, if somebody gives you something to look after, you're not really allowed to give it to somebody else to look after without the owner's permission. It's not the right thing to do. We're discussing a case of Bidi Eved where it comes to court after the fact. You know, like sometimes you're not allowed to do something, but Bidi Eved after the fact, we have to say, all right, now this is the reality. How do you deal with it? Does that make sense? Why do you think you have Korban Chatas? Is that you've made a mistake, you've accidentally broken Shabbos, you didn't do it on purpose. Hashem knows one's intent, but you have to still make restitution for the spiritual damage. That's Bidi Eved. Should you break Shabbos accidentally? No. If you did, does Hashem know your intent was accidental, you didn't mean it, you didn't know it, etc.? He knows. Do you still have to make spiritual remedy? Yes. That's what we mean by Bidi Eved after the fact. So a shomer, a custodian, is not allowed to transfer the deposit to another custodian without the owner's permission. But if he did it, it's not considered an act of negligence, and it does not obligate the first custodian any more than he was before the transfer. This is according to Rashi. Let me explain to you why. We're talking about a case of unpaid custodian, right? So in other words, it's not necessary to state that an unpaid custodian that's deposit is lost or stolen is not responsible. Why, guys? Do you remember what we learned in the 8th daf? Not the 8th daf, sorry, guys. Do you remember what we learned in the 4th daf?
Yes, because a paid custodian is getting paid for, so he's rendering a service and has more responsibility.
Yes, that's exactly right, Kevin. That is exactly right. So what actually happens is what you're saying is right in 11b2 is that the more how do we say this in simple English? Is that at the end of the day, if somebody's asking you to look after something and they're not paying you, you need that aggravation like a hole in the head. You don't want to end up in court, okay, by doing the guy a favor and looking after something. He's going away on holiday, he's going to Australia, wants you to look after his house. He's a friend of yours or he knows you and he trusts you, says, look after it. I don't have extra money to pay you, but just look after it. You can say, fine, I'll do you this favor. But you then can't sue him and obligate him afterwards because you didn't gain anything. Whereas, as Kevin quite rightly said, with the paid custodian, what did we say? Just hang on, guys. We said that his watch has been upgraded. Why? Because he was paid to do a job, and therefore is responsible for more. Okay, because you have an obligation now to look after things much better, because you were paid to do so. And to remember, this was Rav Oshaya's list of the 4 custodians. Gavin, Arthur, are you there?
Yeah, we are.
Okay, let me just find it.
I'm here.
In the 4th daf is in terms of the Shammai. Okay, so just see here. All right, so Kevin, exactly as you said, there are cases of the unpaid custodian, borrower, paid custodian, and the renter. So this is in 4b3. Okay, so I've got it in front of me. Sorry. So exactly as we said, is that take a case of the first person that's looking after it for the owner of the item. He doesn't have to pay as the first person because he's an unpaid custodian, right? And then because an unpaid custodian is not responsible for an object that's lost or stolen. Does that make sense? Now,
yeah, I remember this. Yeah.
It says he's transferred the custodianship to a paid custodian. Okay, and because he's transferred it to a paid custodian, he's actually upgraded the watching of the object. Why? Because somebody that's paid to watch it is now going to be much more responsible because it's his duty. So we're saying that the first person that's unpaid wasn't responsible before. Now that he got somebody else to do it and he paid him, the first custodian is unpaid. He wasn't responsible before and he's not responsible now. In fact, if anything, he upgraded the quality of watching it. Does that make sense? So that first unpaid custodian is not responsible. The question is whether the paid custodian is now responsible. That's an issue we're going to deal with. But the first custodian is not responsible. He should have asked the owner's permission, but maybe let's take a case where the original owner went to Australia and he's there and you couldn't get hold of him and he had to fly down in emergency down to Cape Town to visit his sick, ailing mother. Does that make sense? And he had to get on a flight to sign documents or whatever. So he wasn't being irresponsible. He then had to get somebody quickly to look after the place. Am I making sense, guys?
Yeah, but what I don't understand is I don't understand why the paid custodian is not responsible to the unpaid custodian who had to fly down to Cape Town. Why is he responsible to the original owner?
Let's just clear up two issues. We're talking about, let's just get the case clear. We're talking about whether, firstly, the owner can hold the first custodian responsible. We're going to get to the case of whether he can hold the second custodian responsible. But the first custodian was as follows. Right. The guy owned the object. Okay? He just say he went backpacking in Europe. Let's just say guys in their 20s. And he didn't have the money to pay his mate or his acquaintance to look after his cottage. And he went backpacking in Europe. Now, the guy's not contactable by a phone. He's in Paris on Monday and he's in Milan on Tuesday. Okay. Then suddenly the mate of his unpaid mate that's looking after the place, got an emergency call where he had to fly down to Cape Town to look after his ailing mother. Now, he can't get hold of the owner because he's backpacking in Europe. So he finds somebody that he knows and he pays him to look after the owner's property. He has to leave. Now, he's not responsible, the first custodian, because as an unpaid custodian, he wasn't responsible when he was looking after for stolen or lost objects. And now that he's transferred the deposit to a paid custodian who's even more responsible because he's getting paid for the job, the first one is not negligent in his duty. He didn't just negate his duty. In fact, he upgraded the quality of the custodianship. Does that make sense, Gavin? So the first person isn't responsible.
No, it does.
So that's
what I was saying is exactly...
That's all I'm interested in at this stage. Don't add detail.
Yeah.
Let's just get it clear. Don't add questions now. Okay. Sorry, but let's get one issue clear at a time. Okay. So it's not necessary to state that the unpaid custodian that transferred a deposit to a paid custodian is exempt if the deposit is lost or stolen, for he upgraded the watching of the deposit. Rather, Ulla means that to teach that even if a paid custodian transferred the deposit to an unpaid custodian, so that he now diminishes the watching of the object, he's still exempt if unavoidable loss occurs. So, Kevin, let's not discuss that other issue. It's a different issue.
Okay, no. You've actually self-explained it with those two examples now. I've got it.
Fine. And you've got a good point, but it's a different discussion. This is just a case of the first custodian, is he responsible to pay? Now, Ulla is saying something different. The Gemara is saying it's very clear. In a case where the guy's an unpaid custodian, if it's lost or stolen, he didn't gain anything or get paid for looking after it, he's not responsible. Then for sure, if he upgraded the custodian to a paid custodian and paid it of his own money, he was not negligent at all. In fact, he was very, very responsible. And therefore, he's the first the first guardian or custodian isn't responsible. He did his job. Whether or not the second one is a different issue. So Rav Ulla is now teaching something interesting. Okay? All right. So, which we're going to do now. An unpaid custodian is exempt from theft or loss and certainly for unavoidable accidents. Here, he is exempt just as he would have been had the deposit still been in his possession, since he was not negligent. That's according to Rashi. The second shomer, to answer your question, Gavin, however, is responsible for theft or loss, and the halacha works according to Rav Yossi, who rules in Bava Kamma daf 11b2, that he must pay the original owner rather than the first shomer. All right, I looked at it very quickly for you. How's that?
All right, thank you. That's the answer I wanted, yeah. Thank you.
Now, how's that for quick response?
Very quick. Well done.
Okay, so it's in Bava Kamma daf 11b2.
Awesome.
Sorry, I scrambled.
Yeah, thank you. That was the question I had directly. Thank you.
All right. So basically, a paid custodian will exert himself to safeguard a deposit more than an unpaid custodian will, for the former is liable for theft or loss, while the latter is not. Meaning the paid custodian is responsible for theft or loss, and the unpaid is not. By transferring the deposit to the paid custodian, the unpaid custodian upgraded the quality of watching. He definitely did not commit an act of negligence. That's according to Tosfot. Therefore, he is not more liable than he was before the transfer. Okay. So now Rav Ulla is teaching something different. That's the standard case. Rav Ulla is teaching in the name of Rav Elazar something else now. He's saying if Ulla is saying that even if the paid custodian, the other way around, transferred the deposit to an unpaid custodian, he now diminishes the watching of the object, he's still exempt if an unavoidable loss occurs. Now that's quite something, isn't it?
Yeah.
Kevin, Arthur, can you explain to me what Rav Ulla is saying here, the other way around?
Not really.
Okay. You're saying the original unpaid custodian had acquired the services of a paid custodian.
No. That's the Gemara's
one.
So Rav Ulla, so that we've learned. Rav Ulla is saying something different. He's saying, what happens if we have now, Arthur, please pay attention, a paid custodian, and he's now transferred the deposit to an unpaid custodian. In other words, he's downgraded the quality of the watching.
Oh, okay, got that. Yeah.
So now that he diminished the watching of the object, he's still exempt if an unavoidable loss occurs. For the first custodian gave it to a mentally competent individual who could effectively safeguard the object and thus was not negligent. Okay, that's quite something, isn't it?
100%, yeah.
When you say deposit, what do you mean deposit?
I'm saying, I've given you a laptop. I'm going to Europe, okay? I'm going to Europe and basically, I don't want to use the word laptop. Let's say that even if I give you my house for safekeeping, I've lent you my house. You've got keys. You've got when it uses the word deposit, it could mean two things, Kevin. It's a good question. It could mean either that I've given you a sum of money to look after, because there weren't banks in those days. So let's use a simple example. I've given you an object to look after, a precious object, a ming vase. I don't want my place broken into. So I own a precious ming vase, and I'm saying to you, just take care of it while I'm away. I don't want people know I'm going to leave. I don't want them to break in and take the object while I'm away. Just look after it. So I'm giving you this as a deposit to look after this item. That's all.
I'll give you a good definition. It's something of safekeeping. That's it.
It's safekeeping a valuable. Okay, let's put it.
Yes, a safekeeping of a valuable. Something valuable of safekeeping. That's it.
So fine. So Arthur, now we're learning.
It covers money. It covers objects. Everything.
Yeah. So Arthur, now we're learning the other way around. We're learning that a paid custodian downgraded his watch by giving the unpaid custodian the owner's object to watch, and he's still exempt if an unavoidable loss occurs. For the first custodian gave it to a mentally competent individual who could effectively safeguard the object and thus was not negligent. Can you give it over to me back? Arthur, do you want to explain it to me?
Sorry, I'm exhausted at the moment. I'm having a hard time absorbing stuff, man. I'm exhausted. I've had a little sleep.
Okay, so just,
I can give it a shot and see how it goes.
I just want you to concentrate. Just
Okay.
give it a few more minutes, please, mate. So the normal case is an unpaid custodian upgrades the watch and gives it to a paid custodian. And if the unpaid custodian is not responsible for loss or theft because he wasn't paid, he was doing the guy a favor, for sure, if we upgraded the watch and him on his own money paid the custodian because he couldn't get hold of the other guy, he hasn't been negligent at all. In fact, he upgraded the quality, he's paid his own money, he's gained nothing, he's not responsible.
Okay.
That's clear.
Okay.
This is a reverse case where it's a guy was paid to look after something, couldn't get hold of the owner, had to fly down to Cape Town to look after his sick mother, and then given the object in his care to be looked after by somebody and said, do me a favor, look after it for me, and he never paid the guy. Rav Ulla said, if it's a mentally competent person he gave it to, even if it's an unpaid custodian, and he downgraded his watch, he's still not liable. So that is a very strange thing to say, it seems. Okay. There's two reasons it's not strange. Why? It's because the person was mentally competent. This is known as a responsible individual. Okay. So although he didn't pay him, the first shomer is not responsible. Does that make sense? He shouldn't have done it, but he chose somebody that was, and he had to leave on an emergency. So he didn't choose somebody that was a mental incompetence. So he chose somebody that was functional. So, but it still doesn't make 100% sense. It would that he downgraded it and doesn't have to pay. So we have to look at a very, very clear word that it uses, that he's not responsible if unavoidable loss occurs. Now, there's two sorts of losses. One, if you can't find the object, or it's lost as in it's not rendered useful anymore. In other words, the object
destroyed.
Yeah, it's destroyed. So an unavoidable loss occurs means it's hit by lightning. So even an unpaid custodian, if an object gets hit by lightning, doesn't have to pay. Even a paid custodian doesn't have to pay. So say the guy didn't downgrade the watch. Okay? In other words, the guy's paid custodian. He's responsible for theft and loss, which an unpaid custodian is not. But this case, a bolt of lightning hit the object and rendered it useless. Now, as a paid custodian, he's not responsible for that. So even if he downgraded his watch to an unpaid custodian, he still wouldn't have been responsible whether it was him that looked after it or anybody else. Does that make sense? Because it got hit by lightning, it was an unavoidable loss. So therefore, the first shomer, even though he downgraded the watching, if we hold the first shomer responsible because we say that he's responsible, we can make him responsible, I think, even according to Rav Ulla, for a loss or a theft, because he was paid to look after the object. So if he downgraded it to an unpaid custodian, the first shomer is still responsible for the payment, because that's within his obligation to pay. Does that make sense? But in a case where the object was hit by lightning, the first shomer would still not be responsible, whether he did it himself or he gave it to somebody else to look after. It's an unavoidable loss, it's called. So therefore, whether he was whether he transferred it to somebody else or he did it as an upgraded custodian himself, he's not responsible if it got hit by lightning at all. So therefore, he A, gave it to a mentally competent person, and B, if you want to say he's responsible because even though he downgraded the watching and his watching was upgraded, as a paid custodian, he's not responsible if it got hit by lightning. Arthur, are you with me?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Does that make sense,
I
guys?
got it. Yeah, so basically, if it's an act of God, as they say, you're not responsible.
Yes. In other words, the issue now that doesn't become, because if you turn around and say, but I never told you to do it, and you say, listen, he was mentally competent. All right. But that's fine, but I still never told you. You could turn around and say, but listen, even if I'd been looking after it, I wouldn't have been responsible had it been hit by lightning. If the unpaid custodian had got lost or stolen in his care, then fine, you can make me responsible and I will pay. But I wouldn't be responsible anyway. So that's what Rav Ulla is coming to say. All right. Now, let me just go on to one thing quickly. The Gemara cites a diametrically opposing view. Rav said, if a custodian transferred a deposit to another custodian without obtaining permission from the owner, he's liable to pay for any loss. It is not necessary to state that the paid custodian that transferred the deposit to an unpaid custodian is liable for all losses, for it diminishes the watching of the object. Rather, Rav means to teach that even an unpaid custodian transferred a deposit to a paid custodian, thereby upgrading the watch of the object. He's still liable for any loss. Why? Because the owner may tell him, I chose you to look after my stuff, okay? You weren't paid, and I realize you upgraded the watch and you paid for it or whatever, but I trust you. I don't trust this paid custodian that you chose. My relationship is with you. I know you. I don't trust the second party. And the second custodian is not credible with me with an oath. Okay? So he doesn't have a track record. So even if the unpaid custodian, even an unpaid custodian must swear to the owner that the deposit that he did not commit an act of negligence. You have to take a shavua, according to Rashi. So even that unpaid custodian would have to take an oath. But the person would believe him because he entrusted him to looking after it. He trusts his oath. But a person that's not legally bound is not legally bound to accept the oath of another. It's only the oath of the custodian he chose that he must accept, since he trusted them with the deposit. That's in Bava Kamma daf 3a, according to Rashi. So the owner can claim that he believes the loss came by the second shoma was really due to negligence. And for this reason, the first guardian is responsible for any loss. It's only if there are witnesses that testify to the mishap of the second guardian or custodian that the first shoma would be exempt, if they're objective witnesses. And this is in 36a and b. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
Yep.
Kevin?
Yeah.
Okay, so that does make sense. We've got
5 minutes left.
Okay, we've got one short case, and then we'll go on. I hope we don't need another session, but then we're done. It's the last one. All right, so that's fine. The Gemara cites a seventh ruling. Okay. And Ulla said in the name of Rav Elazar, the law is that we collect payment from the debt from slaves that belong to a debtor. Okay? The Gemara seeks to define the parameters of Ulla's ruling. Rav Nachman said to Ulla, did Rav Elazar say that slaves can be collected from orphans as payment for a debt owned by a deceased creditor? Ulla replied, no. Rav Elazar only said that slaves may be collected as payment from the debtor himself. So Ulla's answer is question, does it need to be said that slaves can be collected from the debt itself? Why? A creditor is entitled to collect even the cloak off the debtor's shoulders. Why would Ulla teach such an obvious law? Okay. We're going to go through it now. The Gemara explains, here's what this is the case we're dealing with, that the debtor made a slave an apotiki and then sold him. Okay, so before we get there, let me just put a bit of background in there quickly. We've got a few minutes, and I hope we can do it in there. All right. So what we're dealing with here is the law is that we collect payment from debt from slaves that belong to a debtor. Now, a creditor is entitled to collect slaves of a debtor's payment for his debt. So we're saying, like, what's so novel about Rav Ulla's explanation of Rav Elazar? We know this. So what is it coming to teach? You can even take a cloak off somebody's back. Why wouldn't you be able to take any one of their other assets? By the way, in terms of the cloak, if it's the guy's only cloak, you're not allowed to take it off his back. By the way, you keep it as a deposit, but you can't sell his only cloak. And if it's cold and it's his only item, you can't take it. It's only if it's an expensive one that you can use it and exchange it for a less one. So that's on that side note. But Rav Elazar rules that if a debtor died and he left slaves as inheritance to his children, the creditor is entitled to collect those slaves as payment for his debt. That's what Rush is asking. He's asking, is that the rule? Do you remember we learned in 8b that creditors cannot collect debts owed them by deceased debtor from orphans of that debtor unless the debtor left them real estate? Guys, do you remember 8b?
Well, not 8b per se, but I remember that concept, yeah.
Okay, so what do you remember?
Exactly what you just said, that they, from the orphans, you can only take property, you can't take anything else.
Correct. So you can't take movable property, and you can't take property that the children had before, that they had in their own acquisition, that had nothing to do with the deceased parent. That's correct. So in 8b, it says the debtor, if the debtor left them real estate, the children, then the creditor can come and collect from that real estate. Remember we talked about redividing the real estate and the one brother compensating the other brother. Remember we had that whole discussion.
Yes.
Fine. So we're saying, what's with regards to slaves? If the father owed a debt to a creditor, can the creditor come and collect from the children the slaves or not? So this is depending if the slave is seen as movable property or a slave is seen as real estate. So that's going to be covered in the 12th daf.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So we're saying that depends. It depends how a slave is defined.
Movable or immovable?
Immovable or immovable. That's exactly correct, Kev. So we're not saying that you can, that there's an issue of whether a creditor can collect from the debtor a slave as payment. Obviously, you can even take a coat. We're saying with regards to, maybe it's asking in regards, Rav Nachman said to Rav Ulla, from orphans as payment for their deceased parent, that the deceased parent owes a creditor. And Rav Elazar said, no, you can't. That slaves can only be collected from the debtor itself, not from the orphan children. So it's saying, well, what is the case here that he's talking about? So 11b3, we're in. All right. Guys, we're on 11b2, we're going to 11b3. So just quickly in summary, Rav Ulla said in the name of Rav Elazar, the law is that we collect payment for debt from slaves that belong to a debtor. That's obvious. You can even take a person's coat if he owes you money. Obviously not if it's his only coat. So why would Ulla teach such an obvious law? So the Gemara is first asking, Rav Nachman said to Ulla, did Rav Elazar say that slaves can even be collected from orphans as payment for a debt owed by a deceased creditor? And Rav Elazar says no, that basically you can't collect slaves as payment from the orphan children, only from the debtor himself, because Rav Elazar sees slaves as movable property and not as fixed property or assets, because they can walk, etc., and they can move from property to property. Whereas animals and equipment live on the farm and have no capacity to work of their own cognizance. In other words, if an animal wanders out of a field, It does it with no thought in terms of understanding that it's the owner's field or another field. Are you with me? It might go to another property, but it has no comprehension. A slave would understand very clearly with human intelligence which property he was on. And therefore, he's known as a movable asset according to Rav Elazar. And that since it's a movable asset, not a fixed asset, it's not like real estate that a creditor can collect from the estate of orphans. Does that make sense? That's his rule. Fine. Ulla's answer is questioned, and it's stated as follows. So what is this case that we're dealing with? We're on 11b3. We're almost done. With the debtor made in slave, when the debtor made a slave in apotiki and then sold him, Ulla I'm going to explain what an apotiki is now. Ulla teaches that Rav Elazar's rule that a creditor may collect the slave from the purchaser. Okay. So let's just discuss. Now we're discussing a different case. Remember we learned that if you had a debtor and he sold land to what? He sold land to a buyer. Remember that a creditor could go and collect his parcel of land from the buyer. Gavin, Kevin, Arthur, do you remember this?
Yeah.
Very clearly.
Fine. If he was if he was owed that money in terms of damages, he could collect high quality land from the buyer. If he was a normal creditor that was owed money, he could collect from average land from the buyer. If it was for the kutub of a woman, she could collect from the low grade of land from the buyer, because the buyer should have checked correctly that there wasn't a lien on a grade of land and should have done his due diligence. Okay, we learned that. That's fine. So now this is a case where we're saying when the debtor, ordinarily, right, slaves cannot, if a slave was bought by the buyer and the seller owed money to other people, the buyer is not in that case generally responsible for paying back the debt with the slave necessarily. Does that make sense? Because
there's no lien on the slave. You can't have a lien on it. It's a movable property.
It's movable property. So we're going to see some sorts of movable property you can, some you can't. In other words, if you still sell, you can pay back livestock in terms of debt and other things, but it's a complicated issue. So all we're learning is Rav Ulla teaches Rav Elazar's rule that a creditor may collect the slave from a purchaser if he made the slave an apotiki. Okay, in other words, this is the default position. A creditor cannot collect the slave from the purchaser if the debtor owed the creditor money and sold the slave. That's the general rule according to Rav Elazar.
Just give me 1 second.
Sure.
It sounds like a Greek word, Damon.
It is a Greek word. Spot on.
Sorry, I'm back. Sorry, I apologize. Carry on.
Okay, Kevin is on fire today.
No.
Yeah, well done, Kevin. Yeah,
No.
you got every question or answer correct. Well done.
Kevin, you are so right. It's scary. The word hypotheke, which is hypotheke. Hypothek.
Hypothek, yeah.
Hypothek.
That's a hypothek, yeah. It's a legal
Hypothek.
word.
Thank
legal
you.
term.
I didn't know how to pronounce it. Hypothek. I don't know if it comes from the word hypothetical. I don't think so. But hypothek is a Greek word that means a pledge or property placed under obligation. How do you say the word, Kevin? Hypothek.
Hypothek.
Okay.
Hypothek. E-C. Hypothek.
Okay, so it's Hypotheke, it says here.
No. Okay, well, that's just, they're spelling it the Greek way.
Yeah, that's the Greek way. But Kevin, you're 100% correct. In Greek, it means a pledge or property placed under obligation. Now, the word hypothek with the C is used today in a legal sense, by the way. Okay, why? because the Talmudic sages often provided Hebrew, Aramaic interpretations for the word they knew to be of foreign origin. So it's not etymological, meaning this particular word didn't come first from the Talmud. In other words, the Talmud used a Hebrew Aramaic word to take a legal concept that was around even in those days in Greek culture. And it's done now in Roman law, English law, etc., that a hypothek with a C is used to denote a pledge or properly placed under obligation. Kevin, you're 100% correct. It wasn't etymological. It was actually written. But funny enough, in Hebrew, an apotiki, they've made it into an acronym. You know what it means? Apotahe ka'e, apotiki, which means the creditor will stand here.
Po is here.
Pardon?
The po is here in Hebrew.
Correct.
Po.
Here.
He is me.
Correct.
He. Yeah, something about here and me. That's.
Yeah, it's saying I will stand here. The creditor will stand here. So it's exactly the same concept, using a play on words as an acronym. They set up an acronym so people would remember the word hypotheke. I don't know how you say it. It's a bit of a tongue. Hypothek.
Yeah.
Okay, so hypothek, which is a property placed under obligation or pledge. Hypothek. So you know your Hebrew well, Kevin. You know your Greek well.
Arthur knows, yeah.
Very, very impressed.
Well, Arthur's also good at Hebrew. He's probably better than me.
No.
Okay.
Arthur just needs a cup of coffee. He's half asleep.
I'm exhausted, but anyway, Karen, I'm
I
staying
can see
awake,
that.
so.
Okay, Arthur, just a few more minutes. Just please, John. But all right. So listen. So only if you make a special apotiki, I only know the Hebrew word, or apothek, the Greek word, meaning you put almost a lien on that slave, meaning that you can place a pledge that the creditor can take that slave in terms of payment on that particular slave in terms of payment. It has to be on that particular slave, that when the purchaser buys it from the original owner that owned a debt on that it's the purchaser's obligation to check at the deeds office if there's some sort of lien or apotiki on that particular slave. And if he was negligent and didn't do his due diligence, it's sorry for him. Does that make sense?
Is there no onus on the debtor to divulge this information voluntarily?
Yeah.
Well,
seems unfair, yeah.
Well, I think a case that, Gavin, we learnt before, that there should be a shtar, there should be a contract. And that if the contract says when it says without a guarantee, it's implying that there's a guarantee, and it's a scribal oversight unless he says the word without a guarantee. So then he has to make good. He has to make good and repay the purchaser. Does that make sense? But it's a lot easier said than done. But the purchaser should also do due diligence. So Rava said, if a debtor designated his slave as an apotiki and then sold him, his creditor can collect from the slave from the purchaser. So it's only if it's that particular slave. But if the debtor owes money and he sold some of his slaves and there was no specific apotiki on that particular slave, the creditor cannot collect from the purchaser. There has to be an apotiki on that particular slave. Also, just so you know, that you can't designate an ox as an apotiki. In other words, if you say that an ox is an apotiki, meaning that the person can collect from your movable property. Because if you owe money, you have to pay for movable property. That doesn't transfer to an ox for two reasons. That's what Rav Ulla is saying in the name of Rav Elazar. And Rav is saying, is that firstly an apotiki can communicate that there's a lien on him or an apotiki on him because he's got the ability to speak. And therefore, an apotiki also looks physically distinctive from another human being. Every human being looks physically distinct. Animals look similar to each other. And because animals cannot communicate with a voice and look similar for each other, it's difficult to distinguish one animal from another. That's the one reason. And the other one, it doesn't become public knowledge. Because slaves talk with each other and they can tell the new owner. A slave can turn around to the purchaser and say, listen, I don't like the old debtor. He drank a lot. He got into debt. There's an apotiki on me. Why don't you give me a new home and take me over? Does that make sense? Because he can communicate himself that there was an apotiki. Because just bear in mind that he examines the slave and that the purchaser can ask the slave, are you an apotiki? And the slave has to answer honestly. Otherwise, he can return it and get his money back.
Is the slave always going to know that whether there's an apotiki on him or not?
Apparently, yes, because there has to be a proper declaration. And he has to acquire the slave. There has to be a proper declaration. So listen, for the sake of a very complex issue, simple. Rabbi just said the following. You can't make an animal an apotiki. In other words, an animal, if a debtor owes money to a creditor, the creditor can take the animals from the debtor, no problem. But if he in turn, the debtor sold some of his livestock to a seller, purchaser, a creditor can't touch it from that purchaser, only real estate. And in terms of the slaves, it's the same thing, except if an apotiki, a pledge was made on one particular slave, that he needed money for a debt, and he said, listen, I'm giving this slave as collateral. So this is placed under obligation as a pledge to pay you. And then he has to call the slave as a witness, as far as I know. And he has to have a shtar, a document, etc. So if it comes, then the creditor can collect it from the purchaser. Because when the purchaser buys the slave and does a transfer of ownership document, he should either have a written guarantee or he should have done his due diligence. Does that make sense, guys?
Yep. And going back to the animal, why can't he have it? I missed it about.
No problem.
They particularly over on an ox.
Two reasons.
Just say that I missed that.
Two reasons on an animal. The first reason on an animal is animals are not distinctive from each other.
Okay, there's. And they don't have rational thought processes, like you said with slaves and.
No. But the first thing is physically they're not distinguishable from each other. Okay. Physically, that's number one. And number two, the animal can't communicate. He can't give testimony. A slave.
Okay. Sure.
Now, so here we go. Here, with what case are we dealing? Where the debtor made the slave an apotiki and then sold him. So as Kevin quite brilliantly said, an apothek means a pledge or property placed on the obligation. And in Hebrew, there's an acronym which says the creditor will stand here. It's apo tahe ka'e, which is the same word as a hypotheke. And a hypothek is used today in a legal sense to basically say that that particular object is under, curatorship in terms of a debt. Okay? So ordinarily, if a debtor owes money to a creditor, the creditor can take the money that's owed to him. But if the debtor sold some of his movable property to a purchaser cannot collect movable property from the purchaser, the creditor that could take money from the debtor. But he can take fixed property, okay? He can take fixed property, but not movable property. And we're saying that there is a case where the creditor can go after the new purchaser that bought the slave from the debtor. And in what case is when the debtor says to the creditor, I want you to loan me money and I will give you this slave as collateral and make an apotiki on him, or an apothek, which basically means that this particular person you owe to is a debt, because the purchaser needs to clarify before he buys a slave from the debtor if there is a apotiki on that particular slave, and he has to do the due diligence. Obviously, if the debtor lies, he would have to take the purchaser would take the case to the Beis Din. And the default position is that he would have to reimburse him if he lied. But there should be a guarantee in the contract where the purchaser is covered. If there's no guarantee in the contract, meaning it says without a guarantee, it's the purchaser's fault for not doing due diligence. Remember, if there's a scribal omission where it doesn't say with a guarantee, it's assumed that there is a guarantee unless the words without a guarantee is furnished. And apotiki cannot be on an animal because an animal is indistinguishable from another animal. All animals look very similar. Like a cow looks like another cow. It's not that easy to distinguish, okay? And also, a human being is very distinguishable from another human being. People look different to each other. And the second reason given, according to Rava, as well as the first, and Rav Ulla in the name of Elazar, is that it becomes public knowledge. In other words, there's rumors around town that the debtor owed money to the creditor and he used the slave as an apotiki. Why? Because people talk in the community. And the apotiki can also testify the fact that he was made an apotiki under oath. Because if the apotiki is made to take an oath or whatever, he has to be honest to the court. Okay, so for that reason, a slave is distinguishable from an animal in terms of becoming an apotiki. And this is brought in Bava Kamma 11b2, okay, in terms of the discernible difference. And initially, this argument was brought forward with regards to 8b in this particular daf of purchasers and debtors, etc., etc. Guys, I want to thank you very, very much. I hope
Damon.
you did well.
Scott, you clarified everything very well.
Listen, I'm sorry about the confusion with the small animals and big. I'm trying to add detail, but the truth of it is there's so much detail that we'll leave that distinction for another day.
Yeah.
100%.
Right, guys.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Shabbos.
You're wonderful.
Shabbos.
All right, we'll resume on Sunday.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Guys,
Cheers,